Well, hello again. Welcome to my series of book collection videos. This time, since we've finished the main biography shelf, I'll have to go into the various coffee table size books that don't really fit on regular shelves, and some various books on film series, franchises, or specific characters. So, again, just moving alphabetically, these are pretty much just the holdovers and a number of paperbacks and television related books as well. So, moving alphabetically, start off with the lovely coffee table sized book that I think is really essential. That is Sir Christopher Frayling's book on the legendary Ken Adam. This came out about the mid to late 2000s, I believe, or 2010 or so, and is a really just essential book on one of the all-time great production designers, and I'd say one of the few individuals that really made the term production designer really just not even begin to examine and explain the brilliant conceptual work that he was able to do. Primarily known for his work on the Bond films, of course, but also for Stanley Kubrick on Doctor Strangelove, and even the amazing period detail in Barry Lyndon. So his prowess was really far beyond the simple term production designer. And this book is really great because not only is it just about his career, but it's also essentially a self-contained biography packed with stills and reference photos and conceptual sketches. So basically, it's a combination biography and overview of his legendary career. So I can't recommend this highly enough. This is a really nice paperback version that's nice on a coffee table, but it's still not very easy to put on a shelf. So you can get this paperback version for quite a bit cheaper than the hardcover. Next up is another essential making of book. I'm sure most people have already read this by now, and if you haven't, you absolutely must. This is Paul Salmon's incredible book on the making of Blade Runner entitled Future Noir. This is the original mid 90s paperback version. He has been able to do an updated version, but it was rushed out to meet the release of Blade Runner 2049. So I know he's been working on a fully updated version with the post 2049 stuff. So you can get that newer copy for pretty cheap, but the printing is not quite as good as this original one, which you can also still get for pretty cheap. So this is my go-to copy, has been for years, and it's jam-packed with stills and everything. But yeah, if you ever wanted to know more about Blade Runner and you just haven't gotten around to reading this book, you absolutely have got to. And hopefully that fully updated version does come out at some point, whether in print or ebook version. But still, just one of the indispensable making of books. This is another really great making of. There are several on this film, of course, but this one is really quite good. It's by Harlan Lebo, who's written a number of these. So this is the behind the scenes of Casablanca, which really goes hand in hand with the Round Up the Usual Suspects making of book, which I've read, but I need to get a copy of. This one's pretty nice, though. It's got the nice glossy cover, and then is packed with stills and things. And it's really, one of the two or three really good books on the making of Casablanca that go hand in hand with the audio commentaries. So highly recommended. Levo's written a number of great books, and then his book on Citizen Kane is really like the best single book compilation of all kinds of Kane material. So if you're looking for one really book on Citizen Kane, this is another one that doesn't really fit on the shelf, so I have to have it with my other coffee table books. This is Chaplin's Life and Pictures, which was his companion volume. It's an autobiography of sorts, but you can see from the large focus and size of the book itself, it's focused primarily on images. So the idea is that he would tell his life story through rare behind the scenes stills and materials, with various bits of text here and there. See if I can find a page with text on here. Yeah, and it really runs the gamut. So it's a really beautifully made book, even though it's getting on up there in years. And of course, it's not a full-on biography. So it's basically a visual representation of Chaplin's career, but beautifully printed. And you can get copies of this for very, very little money because, of course, they are so old. But it's hard to get one in good shape that's not musty and dinged up. It is a very hefty book, so I really would recommend it for Chaplin fans, who I'm sure have already read it at some point. But just a really nice book to have, just kind of too thick and tall to be on a regular shelf. The same can be said for this next book, which is this beautiful book by Peter Cowie about John Ford, specifically titled John Ford and the American West. This is a absolutely gorgeous coffee table book with beautiful printed stills and photos and all kinds of rare pieces, but it's also loaded with actual text, so it's not actually, just a pretty coffee table book. And then included are not just pieces from Ford's work, but also influencing paintings and photos of the West. So this is a really nice overall view of Ford's use of natural landscape, both on location and in the studio, and his conceptual eye visually. So a really, really nice book for Ford fans or just film fans in general who want, a nice coffee table film book. Very, very nicely done. This next one is the same. It really is just a little too big to fit on a regular shelf. But this is the memoir by Sean Hepburn Ferrer about Audrey Hepburn, entitled An Elegant Spirit. But it's a really wonderful, again, coffee table book loaded with great stills and very well printed. But it's another one of these really nice memoirs by the children of the famous person. So it's a nice memoir, but it's a really nice coffee table book. So if I can find some of and it's really extremely well printed. So the stills are extremely well done. So it's nice just to have as a coffee table book. It's a nice memoir as well. So yeah, just another one of these really nice books that doesn't quite fit on a shelf very easily. This next one is another making of by Harlan Lebo. This one's probably the best book on the series in terms of a behind the scenes look. This is entitled The Godfather Legacy. It's a making of behind all three films, and like the Casablanca book, is loaded with on-set images, production stills, and really great anecdotes, and is really well put together. Very, very easy to read, very enjoyable, and a very inexpensive book. I think really anybody who's a fan of the Godfather films should have a copy of this because you can get a copy for so cheap. So I really recommend this. It's really the one great book about the Godfather trilogy of films in terms of production and making of. So if you're looking for something to supplement the DVD and Blu-ray supplements and commentary, this should be your go-to source. This one's really kind of a goof. It's one of the many books that tries to give a realistic look, or it's essentially one of the science of a certain series. So this is the basically the realistic look at the Indiana Jones films, entitled simply "Why Did It Have to Be Snakes?" I've read a number of these. Usually they're kind of a one and done read, but I just found a copy of this and haven't got to read it yet. So figured it'd be fun to leaf through. I really need to get the making of indie books that go hand in hand with the making of Star Wars books, but since they're big coffee table books, they're usually very pricey. But anything indie related, I'll read, because there's actually not a whole lot of Indiana Jones related books outside of the couple official books and making ofs. Certainly nothing like the extent of Star Wars books that are out there. So if there's anything indie related, I'll read. Although I wish they hadn't advertised that it has Crystal Skull sections, because nobody wants that. Now this is definitely something you don't see very much anymore. An entire book devoted to the making of and production of a modern film. So I was very interested when I found out this existed, and let alone actually find one, because it's not like there's a bunch of copies of this floating around. So this is an old-fashioned making of movie book all about Kingdom of Heaven. And it's really nicely put together, packed with stills and production materials, and is really the complement to the fantastic supplements on the 4-disc DVD set and the Blu-ray of the director's cut. So if you ever wanted more than just the super long, awesome documentary and all the extras on the disc releases, you can get this lovely book to supplement it. And it's a nice soft cover that if you're really wanting to find it, if you love this film as much as I do, you can get this for very cheap. It's just kind of hard to track a copy down. This next one is a really nice, interesting one. Again, from a time period where, there was no internet, there was no place to look up films and reviews, or just, anybody and their brother posting a blog post about a film. So this is sort of a overall history, but with critical analysis thrown in. And I think it's quite a nice volume. So this is the Films of Sherlock Holmes, and it's ostensibly to gather together all of the various Holmes films up to this point in time, starting in the silent era, and pack it full of stills and then little critical pieces about each of the films, kind of telling you about the stars, production, and the quality of the films that the writers had seen. So again, this is from a time where there was no internet, but it's really really well put together, and the stills in here are just jam packed and really well printed in black and white. So this is just a really nice volume. I love books like this. And what's really great is you can usually dig around used bookshops and find stuff like this that are real gems for very, very little money. And if there's anything these videos should indicate, I really have a problem. I can't leave a book on a shelf, especially if it's less than $1. This one was really super cheap. So I had a lot of fun reading through this because, of course, outside of Dracula, there are more adaptations of Sherlock Holmes than anything else. So basically, you could write, dozens of books like this and not even scratch the surface. Next are some books about not only the history of Star Trek, but some of the actors and creative people and the production history. So to start off with, pretty easily the best one I've come across. And just a really great essential book that's very no frills, and I just couldn't stop reading it. So this is the part 1 of 2 of the 50-year mission. This is a book that details basically the history of the original series and the first 6 original series feature films, and basically the history of Star Trek for the first 25 years or so. But it's basically told in interview form with all of the important cast and crew of everything, and it is full on, uncensored, no frills, straight from the horse's mouth. That's the impression you get from reading this, and it's really great because it helps you cut through the swath of all of the official stuff and featurettes and stuff where you see the same stories get repeated over and over. And it really helped me because I only recently, in the past few years, got into Star Trek. So I'd read some of the other books, and then stumbling across these really made things a lot clearer. So if you're looking for one book on Star Trek, definitely start here. And then the companion volume, which covers the continuation series and other films, also entitled 50-Year Mission, the next 25 years, with a lovely matching cover. This is basically part 2, so all the same stuff applies, except it pretty much goes up until the present when these were made, when the new Abrams films were being made. So that's where this book kind of cuts off. And I don't know if I'm sure they might do a third volume at some point to do all the other materials that have come out since then. But both books combined are pretty thick. So this will give you the best overall history of Star Trek and its production. So very, very highly recommended. Then next up, another one I would very much recommend is Nicholas Meyer's memoir, View from the Bridge, which is focused primarily on, it's basically a memoir, but there are significant portions about Star Trek, particularly the making of Wrath of Khan and the writing of Star Trek 4 and then the making of Star Trek 6. But it's a lot more than that. It's basically an autobiography / memoir, and it's a really good one because, of course, Meyer's a great storyteller to begin with. So very, very highly recommended, even if you're not a Star Trek fan. It's a great viewpoint that you're not exactly going to get all the time of a writer, director, producer, and somebody who's always kind of been on the outer fringes of the main industry, as it were. So I didn't even know this existed until I stumbled across it. So I had a really fun time reading this, and I would recommend it even to non-Trek fans. And of course, you have to have Leonard Nimoy's autobiography. This, of course, is in response to his famous first book, I Am Not Spock. So this is the second book, I Am Spock, which is just I always thought was funny that he, in finally coming to terms with everything, he basically just said, "Yeah, that was a bad idea writing that first book." So you have this volume, which is really great, and then eventually Shatner wrote his own, which uses a very similar cover photo. So this is Shatner's book about Leonard Nimoy, which Shatner's written a number of Star Trek books, but these kind of go hand in hand. Um, so there's those two. And then the main Shatner books, although they're, written with somebody else, these are essentially making of history books that came out before the 50-year mission books, long before. So you have Star Trek Memories and then the Movie Memories companion volume. And I picked these up because, they were supposed to be making of production books, which that material is pretty good. But then, it's also supposed to be like the memoirs of Shatner at the time, and so they're interesting reads, I suppose. But I read them more for the production stuff. But then I found a lot more information in the 50-year mission books. So these are interesting, and if you want to read everything, then I'd say definitely go ahead. But you're going to get a lot more out of the 50-year mission books. This next one is another oversized coffee table book that just kind of sticks off the shelf, so I kept it separate for this video. This is the memoirs of the art designer Alan Tompkins, who worked on many, many, many classic and important films, but primarily worked in the original Star Wars trilogy, which is why this book is entitled Stars and Wars. But he worked on everything from Empire Strikes Back to Lawrence of Arabia, 2001, and even Saving Private Ryan. And this is a wonderful put together book. And what's nice about this is the aspect is designed specifically to show off stills. So as you can see, it's definitely more of a rectangular shape, which really lends itself well to storyboards and concept drawings and set stills. And I really do recommend this, even though it's only partially about Star Wars. It's not exactly going to be essential if you're building a Star Wars bookshelf. But if you're a film geek like me, have a book about with production materials and reminiscences from Star Wars and Lawrence of Arabia and 2001, this is definitely a really great read. Now, this next one I recommend to all Batman fans, although even though it's in the title, not everybody may make the distinction of who this person is. This is Michael Uslan's memoir, The Boy Who Loved Batman. And what's great about this is not only is Michael Uslan a enormously important comic book historian and advocator of the importance of comic books, but it was his efforts that led to the first Batman feature film, and his executive producer credit with Benjamin Melnicker. And had it not been for his really tireless crusade with the studios and actually buying the rights to Batman and shopping them around for years and years and years and years and years, with many, many innumerable failures, we would not have the comic book film landscape that we have today. There would have been no Batman feature film the way we had it in 1989. And that's the reason why his name is still credited on all Batman feature productions and straight-to-video anything. So if there's anything that has Batman in it or is about the Batman universe, you'll usually see Michael's name being credited as an executive producer, which still ties back to his original efforts to get the rights and get the first serious feature film made. So this is a really great memoir, and it also goes into a lot of that 10-year period of just trying to get a Batman series feature off the ground. So since I'm really obsessed with learning about the production histories of the original Batman films at Warner Brothers, this was a really great read, and it's highly recommended to all Batman fans, particularly of the feature films. Next up is a gigantic tome. This is definitely, again, from the era pre-internet where they cranked out a lot of these really nice film books loaded with stills, or there would be compilations or filmographies, basically. So there's a number of books about individual studios or producers or directors or things, but there's a series that pretty much I didn't know they did all the major studios when I was growing up because I would see them in libraries and stuff. So I thought there were a few, but they did try to do a book on each major studio. So this is the Warner Brothers one, entitled The Warner Brothers Story. So you can see this is a really thick, massive tome I'm kind of having to hold up here. But this basically goes through the entire classic era period of Warner Brothers, and all of the stars in this lovely old school photo collage headshot collage. But what's great about this is it gives you an entire history of Warner Brothers from the inception and the first theaters and productions that they did, loaded with stills from that era. But then when you actually get to the films, it goes chronologically and basically goes through the major films from each era, each year. I'm trying to flip through and show some of the full page stills, but it's kind of hard to flip through this because it's literally so heavy. And then entire sections on the birth of sound and jazz singer and Don Juan and things like that. But it goes chronologically and basically gives the major highlights of each year of Warner Brothers. So here you have a section on 1932, and there's stills of Cagney vehicles and I'm a Fugitive from a Chain Gang, among many others. So this is really just a wonderful book to just have on the shelf and be able to pull off and flip through. And every page, it's not just the stills, but every single page is printed on very glossy cardstock. So it's a really, really nice volume, and I would love to get the other volumes on MGM and Paramount and such. But yeah, you'll see these dotting used bookstores and usually beat to crap, but they're wonderful if you've never read them. They're basically miniaturized. Well, they're not quite miniature. This thing is quite massive and very heavy. But it's basically a tome that condenses down the studio history and significant features year by year. And the stills and the printing quality is really, really great. So I love this book. And then last on this shelf, we get to Z. And this is the official history of the character of Zorro, entitled Zorro Unmasked. This was written around the time of The Mask of Zorro coming out in 1998. So this is basically a history of the character from his inception in 1919 with The Curse of Capistrano and all of the Johnston McCulley stories through the various feature adaptations, the Disney television series, and cliffhanger serials, all the way up until the 1998 relaunch with the film. So if you ever wanted to know more about Zorro, this is pretty much the one book to seek out. And it's a really nice book that is loaded with stills. You wouldn't think it would have as many stills as it does because it's just a little paperback, but it's really well put together, really well researched. And again, if this is pretty much the one stop for the character's history. And this character cannot be his importance can't be understated, because basically if it weren't for Zorro, there would be no costume crime fighter ever. And in a lot of ways, you can look at The Curse of Capistrano as the first real superhero story and something we might recognize. And then, of course, the following year, Doug Fairbanks Sr. and The Mark of Zorro is essentially the first superhero film. And, of course, the influence on Batman and everybody else is just, it's hardwired into all the characters. So I was really happy to find a complete history of the character, because I've always found Zorro fascinating and always wanted to know more, so this is definitely the place to find that out. Well, you thought I was done, but I'm not done. Now I have a stack of film-related paperbacks that I kind of have on a little side shelf. Some of these I just picked up because the paperback was obviously cheaper or is in great shape. So this is Mary Astor's autobiography entitled A Life on Film. It's actually pretty candid, so if you're a big fan of her as an actress or certain films, of course, the Maltese Falcon in particular, this is a really great read, and one of the earlier film star biographies or autobiographies that was out there that actually is relatively substantial and not just the usual everything was great and everybody was lovely. And then kind of tying into that, this is another paperback. This is basically conversations and a sort of memoir. So it's entitled This and That, Conversations with Betty Davis. And if you ever wanted to just hear Betty Davis go on and on about everything Hollywood related and other things non-film related in book form, this is the book for you. It's a lot of fun, and so I'd love to read this actually. And then this is the paperback copy of probably the most famous book of Pauline Kael's writings entitled "I Lost It at the Movies." So this is one of the key film critical texts that a lot of classes still use. A lot of people have read. A lot of people name check. So it's definitely good to have a copy of this on hand because Kael is one of the extraordinarily important film critical voices when film criticism was really emerging as a respected form. Not that I agree with a lot of the way she did things, particularly the Raising Cain book, which is just completely horrible, and other things like that. But this is basically, the most notable of her published books on film criticism. A lot of these film paperbacks have information that hasn't necessarily been republished, and some are definitely on the rarer side. Some of these these next ones are kind of that way. Sections of this have been republished in the Making of 2001 book, but it's really great to have this, which is literally the making of Kubrick's 2001, which is an old Signet paperback, pretty much from the day, but it is loaded with. It's quite thick, so it's very hard to open, but it's actually got a full-on huge section of stills from the film and behind-the-scenes materials, which is really uncommon for a paperback. As you can see, it's a significant chunk of the whole book. And then, it's got interviews from the time. It's got a huge extra section and annex. It's got the Playboy interview that Kubrick gave about 2001. That's just a beautiful interview. So, yeah, this is just absolutely essential, even though some pieces from this have come, back into print via other books. So, for the longest time, this was pretty hard to come by, as was this, which was Arthur C. Clarke's book on 2001, both the novel and the film. So this is The Lost Worlds of 2001. So this is a work Clarke actually put together with his own personal remembrances of the film and then some of the making of materials. So it's basically his diary of the making of the film, plus the original Sentinel short story that inspired the whole process. So anyway, this is just an essential book, and it's you have to have it as a 2001 completist, really. And for the longest time, this has also been very difficult to find. I didn't know this book existed, but it also ties into the making of film paperbacks that really kind of exploded in the 70s and early 80s and then kind of died off. So this is entitled The Odyssey File, which is by Arthur C. Clarke and Peter Hyams about the making of the film version of 2010, Odyssey 2. This is a really nice book because there's not a whole lot out there about the 2010 film. Most people choose to ignore it or the book sequels, or just kind of reference it every once in a while and in sort of a manner of, oh, well, that was okay, but it's not 2001. So I really enjoyed reading this, and it's got a whole photographic section, which is actually in color, and it's done lengthwise. So this is a nice piece if you actually find a copy of this. Same thing goes for the Bob Balaban's diary of the making of Close Encounters. This, again, is his actual diary from the making of the film, published in paperback form, but of course it's basically from the horse's mouth on the set of the making of Close Encounters, and particularly the arduous task of filming the entire closing sequence in the giant looks like a former airplane factory in Mobile, Alabama. So yeah, this is a really fun book and essential if you're a giant fan of Close Encounters. And then to round this off, the big one that's still out of print and goes for quite a big dollar amount, actually. So I was very happy to find this in a local shop for 99 cents. Also from the horse's mouth, this is David Petrow's book on the making of Superman the movie, which he started out just writing this book, but basically served all kinds of functions on the production staff and basically stayed through almost the entire shoot of the original film. So this is absolutely indispensable, and you literally feel like you're a fly on the wall of the set of the original 1978 Superman. So I can't recommend this book enough. It does have a photo section with some behind-the-scenes materials, but this is just essential, and it's a real shame it's never been put back into print. So copies of this definitely usually go for $20 to $30 on eBay at least, and it's hard to find one that's not beat to crap because most kids read this until all the pages fell out. So a very, very great book that I would highly recommend if you can find a copy. Well, that does it for the film related materials. Now I have a couple books on television, and they're actually all comedy related. So here are my books on Python. This is the most essential work, really. This is the autobiography of the Monty Python troupe entitled The Pythons by the Pythons. This was published in about 2005, so it's definitely not updated to the most current day, but it's done in the conversational interview style format where each paragraph will be, one of the Pythons talking about their history or whatever the topic is at hand. An original coffee table book that was really great, but very expensive. And this paperback version is much easier to handle and is still loaded with the same amount of amazing stills. And the printing quality here is really exceptional. And it's a really nice, intimate look at their history. It goes through all of their childhoods and then how they initially came together and then the making of Flying Circus and then the feature films and then sort of the aftermath post Meaning of Life. And what's really great is they have tons of remembrances from Graham Chapman's loved ones and family, and also diary excerpts and interviews kind of mixed in. So you sort of get a sprinkling of what he might have said. Of course, sort of an idea since his untimely death long before this book was ever put together. But if you're looking for one book on Python and the sort of history and the mentality of the group, this would be the one to pick up. And I had to pick up the book on the making of Life of Brian, and simply entitled Monty Python's Tunisian Holiday, which makes it sound like a fun, lovely experience and time in the sun, which, of course, it was a lot more arduous than that. So this is a lovely book written by someone who was there the entire time. So again, you get the sort of fly on the wall type experience. The you are there idea definitely applies to this. So if you're a giant fan of Life of Brian like I am, this is just phenomenal. So this is another I had to pretty much read in one go. And a number of the Pythons have written their own autobiographies or memoirs, and Eric Idle just did one not too long ago. This is John Cleese's book, which basically, as far as I can tell, it's supposed to be the first volume of several, because it pretty much cuts off right as Flying Circus gets going. So I guess that was the joke. So this is his autobiography entitled "So Anyway." Love the cover and everything. This is a paperback version, so I just saw it for cheap and picked it up. I haven't gotten to read it quite yet, but I really want to. And again, it's supposed to be the first of several volumes from what I can tell, maybe 2 or 3, but I haven't heard or seen as to when the next volume of this might ever come out. But, it's quite full length, and you would think this was his entire autobiography, but no, it literally stops right at Flying Circus. So that's the gag, I guess, to keep you interested. And then last is another one of these books that's compiled from interviews. This pretty much is just like the 50-Year Mission Star Trek books, but it's about Saturday Night Live and its history, so entitled Live from New York. If there was one book on SNL, this would be the one. Of course, it stops in the early to mid 2000s when this book was published, but again, it's just beautifully done, and everybody pretty much talks uncensored, and it's no frills, and this is what you get, and you just can't put it down. And it's also great because, again, this is extremely uncensored. So when I was reading this, I thought I could open it up, and all the cocaine would just spill out, because it was like, especially in the early days and into the 1980s, it was like everybody was kind of flying by the seat of their pants and anarchy reigned, which is something that you kind of think is missing these days, but also health and safety is also a nice thing. But anyway, so yeah, this is pretty much the book on SNL, and I love these conversational interview round table style things where everybody gets to put their 2 cents in and not worry about it going through the official sieve and official filtering of, everything was great. So since we're already here, I figured I'd go over my various music books and books on bands and such, since it's right next to the other books I've been going over. So I guess first of all, I'll go through the various music and rock and roll biographies, autobiographies, kind of alphabetized by subject. So first up is the really great memoir by Carrie Brownstein, which is about her time both solo and in Slater-Kinney, but Hunger Makes Me a Modern Girl, which is a wonderful, wonderful read, especially if you're a fan of Slater-Kinney. So great modern memoir. This one's actually pretty good because this band has a lot darker of a story than most people realize. So this is Belinda Carlisle's memoir, which of course goes over her time in both the Go-Go's and as a solo artist. And again, the Go-Go's are really underrated and have a lot darker history than people realize. And this one's, they sold bukus of this when it came out, and I read it when it was in the library. And then finally found a cheap used copy, and it's still a good read. This is Clapton's autobiography. And if you ever wanted to know more about old Slowhand here, this is a really nice read. Of course, this came out a number of years ago, so I'm sure there would be more to add since this was published, but this is one of the really solid rock and roll autobiographies out there that again you can pick up for dirt cheap. This one I haven't read yet, but I've heard tons of really good stuff about it. So this is Kim Gordon's Girl in a Band, of course, most famous for her long time in Sonic Youth, and I hoping to get through this pretty soon, but I've heard a lot of great stuff about it. And this one's similar to the Clapton book. They sold tons of this, and it just sounds appealing, and it is, and it's a great long read, and I'm curious. It'd be really funny to see what the audiobook was like if the actual subject read it himself. So of course this is Keith Richards' Life, which again, it was such a landmark to get him to sit down and write his story. And it's definitely entertaining. Let's put it that way. And also, I know I said this about the SNL book, but like, you just imagine they should have like packed the spine with cocaine because that's what it feels like. It's just gonna all the drugs are gonna literally come out of the book. But yeah, reading this will give you a real contact high. No, it's a really entertaining book, and again, they sold thousands and thousands of these, so you can get a nice copy like this for super cheap. And I'm actually wanting to reread this because I read it back when it came out, and I've kind of forgotten stuff. But it's just a fun, really rambling, nice and thick, just pure rock and roll book. All right, so the rest of these will just be by separated by individual bands. So I'll have a lot of books on the Doors because there are literally every time you blink, there's another 10 books on the Doors, and it all is about the myth and the mystique and or a pictorial history, and it's the same stuff regurgitated over and over. But I think it really got the whole furor over the band got kicked up. This was just before, a few years before the Oliver Stone movie, which is so grossly inadequate, and the inaccuracies abound so bad that I think the Stone movie is basically like a 2-hour plus acid trip because just they got the names right. That's about it. But anyway, I think the whole mystique and the rebirth of interest in the band got started by No One Gets Out of Here Alive, which is the biography that's kind of written in a very attention-grabbing way. And there's a lot of good stuff in here, but there are some other books and some of the memoirs that try to tell it a bit more matter-of-factly. But this is still a good read, and as you can see, this is the paperback version, and they sold millions and millions of these, and I think this is what really got the interest sparked in the band again. So, and this paperback still has the photograph section, which is actually, there are also photographs mixed in here, actually printed on the page, which is pretty cool. So, this is essential for any Doors fan. You've probably already read it. Or if you just want to know more about the band, it's still an okay read and a good source, but it's been supplanted by a few other things, but it still holds up pretty well. And definitely, if you've only seen the Stone movie, at least check this out to get a more, shall we say, at least slightly accurate view of what the band was really like. And then each of the band members wrote some memoirs. This first one is John Densmore's, which is entitled Riders on the Storm. This came out in the early 90s, and you do get some historical background of the band, but it's really much more him coming to terms with all of the fallout of Jim Morrison's death and how the band broke up and then how they all tried to survive throughout the intervening years. And again, this was before the whole rebirth and before the Doors Music Company started making countless reissues and driving the band's popularity back up along with the Stone film. So this is my personal favorite of the memoir books because it's a lot more personal, and there are several sections in here that are sort of Densmore almost like writing down his own mental consciousness or like a diary to himself. So I really thought that was an interesting approach. And again, it's a much more personal book, which I really did enjoy. The other thing, I know this copy it's a bit old, but I did go to a book signing where John Densmore actually autographed it to me. So this is one of the few books that I actually have that's autographed and specifically dedicated to me. I don't really go for autographed copies, but this was just one of the few times where I got to go to an actual book signing, and it was just something really, really cool. So of course I will treasure this like there's no tomorrow, even though it's a bit in dodgy shape. And the book signing was actually for his later book called The Doors Unhinged, which is all about the court case that arose over the usage of the name of the band, and Densmore, and along with Jim Morrison's extending family, trying to protect the integrity of the name and the band as it was. And this is really great because most people know of the court case, but they don't know why it happened or what the details were. And this book basically gives you all of that from the horse's mouth, and it goes into a lot of detail and details the entirety of the court case as well. So it's very important. If you've ever wondered about that situation, you definitely should check this book out. And this came out in about 2011 or 2012, I think. So this book came out in 2013, and this was the book signing that I went to. So, and I didn't want to wash my right hand for like 3 weeks, because it's like, this hand shook the hand of the drummer of Break On Through, man. I will never wash this hand ever again, man. And next up is Ray Manzarek's book entitled Light My Fire. This is actually a really great read, although Ray has a much more, I'm trying to think of the right word. The writing style is very, very much in Ray's own voice, I suppose. So it is a much more conversational in style, and he does go through his childhood and stuff, which I found was really the childhood portions, his background, and the building of the band I felt were the most interesting parts of the whole book. And then it goes through the band's career and a little bit of the aftermath, because this is a book from the early to mid 90s. So yeah, and there are some tensions when he discusses some of the other band members, particularly John Densmore, because I think this is really before they all kind of buried the hatchet. But it's still a good read, and it's nice to have as a companion volume to all the other books. And again, it's much nicer to get actual statements from the band members instead of 500 books written by other people just regurgitating the same thing over and over. And it's definitely on the thicker side. So if you're a Doors fan, I definitely think it's essential. But if you're just looking for a straight biography, maybe not what you should go for. But I still enjoy it. So yeah, that's the companion book. This one doesn't get mentioned as often, and I just found it by accident, but it is really interesting. So this is from, I believe it's from the early 80s, back around the time, 1983. So this is back when they did the greatest hits compilation and stuff like that, and tried to popularize the Doors again in the 1980s. So this is the illustrated history. And what's interesting about this, it's never been republished from what I know of, but it's literally hundreds and hundreds of extremely well printed stills on glossy paper, but it's actually filled out with really, really great text. And then all of the promotional materials, all of the newspaper clippings they could find, critical reviews from the time period are basically put together to build the complete illustrated and chronological history of the band. And it's a really, really wonderful volume. I was just astonished at how good this was. Like, for example, here's an article from the Miami Herald, and there's a photo of Jim, and this is all about the fallout after the Miami incident. So it goes through the whole gamut, and there's even extra stills that they couldn't fit in anywhere else. Are also tucked in here, and then eventually they switched over to also including some color stills. And again, the printing on this is really, really good. It's this nice glossy paper. So it's a really, really great piece for fans, but it's never been reprinted for anything I know. And I think used copies of this can go for a decent amount of money simply because it's never been reprinted. So this is definitely a really great find, and the text is great, and it's definitely a time capsule. So I do recommend this for fans very, very much if you happen to stumble across a copy of this. It's not essential, but it's a really, really cool piece with great photos, and I really like the time capsule quality of having all of the newspaper and critical clips from the time period. But if you're looking for one straight ahead book that has biography and photos and stuff, your best bet is the wonderful coffee table book Doors by the Doors, with the writer Ben Fong Torres. And of course, you have a bunch of rock luminaries and other folks giving forewords and such. This is a straight ahead coffee table book, and you get this cool see through cover, which, of course, if I can get this off, it's sort of a light plastic material. So you have the logo with the orange, yellow, and then the actual book has an actual cover underneath it. And then, so as you can see, this is a full head coffee table piece, but it's definitely laid out in the conversational interview format style, which is really nice. And as I've said before about some of the other books I've been going over, I really enjoy history books that go through an entire history of a group or television show, series, whatever, and does it in an interview style. And the photos in here are wonderful. The printing's great. It's a little hard to show coffee table books on on my camera, but anyway, just to give you an idea. So if you were just going for one book on the doors, this would definitely be the one to go for. I got this at one of those. I don't think it was Barnes and Noble, but it was a bookstore, and they had one of those bargain shelves like Barnes and Noble does when they clear out remainder copies. So that's why the cover on this is a little dinged up, but it's definitely worth your time. It's a great display piece, great coffee table book, great content in here. So if you're looking for one book on the doors, this would probably be the best one overall. But of course, it's a coffee table book, so it means it's not going to cooperate with your shelf most likely. So moving on to other bands, there's not really very many books about this band. It's just one or two autobiographies, but I think they're extraordinarily underrated and one of the best bands of all time. So of course, when this came out, I had to check out John Taylor's memoir, In Their Pleasure Groove, Love, Death, and Duran Duran. This is a really nice book. It's a great read for Duran fans. But of course, it's obviously going to be one person's perspective and not just a objective band history or biography. But since there's not a whole lot of information out there outside of fan circles, this was just a fun, great read. So if you're a fan of the band or even a passing fan, it's a really good read, and it's really great because it goes into the later years and then the period where he left the band and all the later years once you rejoin the band. So anyway, really, really great read, great for fans, essential for fans, really. So there are, of course, a number of books about Joy Division. I have read Peter Hook's book, which is really, really good, and I want to get a copy of it. But I want to get the hardcover because it's printed with really cool black hardcover with black lined pages and stuff to mimic the cover of Unknown Pleasures. So I do have Deborah Curtis's memoir, which is, of course, entitled Touching from a Distance. This became the basis for the biopic film Control, if you've seen that, and is basically the go-to book for Joy Division fans. So, again, it's a memoir, but it does kind of give a history of where everybody's heads were at that time point. And if you're at all interested in Joy Division or Ian Curtis, it's definitely one of those super essential books. It's kind of difficult to get sometimes. I had to buy a used copy because sometimes it goes out of print for some reason. But definitely one of the like 2 or 3 essential books on Joy Division for sure. Now, I know there's a ton, and I mean a literal ton, Probably not quite as many as there are Doors books, but it's pretty close in terms of books on Kurt Cobain and Nirvana, and practically anything related, even if it's kind of questionable how it's related. But it's been a while since I've read all the biographies and such. But I remember this one being like the really solid biography. So this is Michael Azerrad or Zerad. I don't know how you say his last name, but this is the book titled "Come as You Are: Story of Nirvana." And for my money, this is the best book on their entire career and history, and the band members, and then the sudden rocket to stardom, and then the immediate aftermath. This is the updated version, which adds a little bit of extra information. But of course, there's been a lot of books published since then, but they're primarily like analysis books or entirely about Kurt and Kurt's life or Kurt's journals, even. But if you're looking for like just a regular biography to learn more about the band, this would be the one to go for, I would argue. Um, Again, there have been so many more books that have come out since this that there may be one that goes into more detail about stuff that's happened in the intervening years. But for my money, this is the best single volume. And then, kind of along the same lines, there's a number of books about REM. And but if you want just like the best single volume that actually tells you their story, then what you need to check out is Tony Fletcher's Remarks. But this is the updated version entitled Remarks Were Made, which went up through about the early to mid 2000s. And now he's been able to write a third volume post their breakup. So I need to get a copy of that. But this book is essential if you're a fan of the band at all. It goes into amazingly great detail. It's a fantastic biography. And there's not really, outside of this particular book, there are, tons of interviews and things, but there's not anything that actually gets into the nitty gritty detail like this does. So I think this is really indispensable. There are a number of other really good books like Crawl from the South, just about, four or five others, but I think this one really is the best in terms of just telling you their entire story. But of course, you need to get the most updated version to actually get it through modern times. So this is the second version, and it's this nice little paperback. This is actually a UK printing, which is why it's a little bit smaller. But it is, as you can see, it's quite thick. Gets into the nitty gritty very, very well, and I just need to get the third updated version. And then lastly, two autobiographies from members of the Who. This one is relatively recent and a great read. This is Roger Daltrey's book, Thanks a Lot, Mr. Kibblewhite, which is a very, very cheeky title that you understand when you read the book because it's in reference to a school principal who basically said that he would never amount to anything. Love the cover design. Here's a shot from the Tommy tour and the classic fringe jacket. So it's a great read for Who fans or just passing fans or just people who like to read rock and roll books. But it's always great to get the other perspective, particularly from the front man who had to basically hold down the fort with everybody else always going mad, thrashing around on stage. But yeah, it was great that Roger actually sat down and wrote a book, because this is a nice companion piece to Pete's book that came out a number of years ago entitled Who I Am. Essential reading this. In fact, it's so good, I wish it was longer. It was always rumored this was, kind of cut down significantly for publication, and it's still rather thick. So I hope one day we get a second volume or there's an expanded version. Of course, the rear is a nice shot of a guitar that has only a few seconds left to live. But yeah, this is essential for Who fans. This is essential for music fans or anybody who likes to read music biographies. Just you can't put it down. I remember scraping together everything just to be able to pre-order this thing as soon as it was announced. So again, super highly recommended. There's also recently published Kenny Jones, who was in the Who in the late 70s, early 80s for the two post-Keith Moon albums, also published his memoir, which is really good. It's called Let the Good Times Roll. So I recommend that as well, even though it's only about the Who for, particular section, it's a really great book because you get a whole time capsule of his time in the Small Faces and the Faces and swinging London and being around everybody else and playing a lot of sessions and stuff. Well, that does it for this section of my book collection. Thanks for listening to me babble on, and hopefully you found some new books to check out or some old favorites that you'd like to find in your library or get a copy of for your own shelves. So until next time, thanks for watching, everybody.